Looking back over the past 4 years, if there's any one truth you can say about the presidency of Donald Trump, it is this. Never has any American president been as controversial as the 45th president of the United States. Never has someone been more hated or more loved by the American people. Think of this. 27 million more people came out to vote in 2020 than voted in 2016. And while President Trump expanded his voting base by 12 million voters, Joe Biden received 15 million more votes than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. The old adage that people vote for or against the guy in office has never been more true. But notwithstanding election challenges that were launched questioning changes to election laws in Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, it appeared when the Electoral College met on January 6th, there would be at last a final determination of the presidential race. Mike, the chaos that ensued Wednesday when the electors met, with protesters storming the Capitol, was as disturbing as anything most Americans have ever witnessed. What was your interpretation of events?
Well, I got to say, it's a hard one. There's a lot of emotions, but as somebody who's had the honor to serve our military for 10 years as an Army officer and be a Senate staffer for 5 years and sworn to uphold our state and county laws as an elected official and as a gubernatorial appointee, I have to say that yesterday was arguably one of the saddest in our nation's history. And it really wasn't, it was sad because of the storming of the Capitol and what the Capitol represents. But I think really it was that we had a sitting president that incited a group of followers to attack citizens of their own country and another branch of government, and that was executing its constitutional duty, and they did. I mean, that's the thing that's stunning. And I think, unfortunately, sadly, something like this has been coming for a long time since Trump had been elected. But honestly, I think it points that there are bigger issues that we've got to go back and address. Politically, that goes back to Clinton and Gingrich back in '94, and unfortunately created a caustic political environment from that time, and neither side seems to be able to engage with each other. Economic issues that neither party has addressed, and race. And if yesterday wasn't a clarion call for all of us to figure out how to collectively and realistically address these issues, I really don't know what is.
Well, there are a lot of different opinions, obviously, that have occurred over the past few years. Now, Phil, almost 75 million people voted for Donald Trump, and many felt that their grievances as to the handling of the election hadn't been heard or satisfied. So how are we going to address that issue?
Well, first of all, that's correct. The grievances have not been heard and they have not been satisfied. And I think one of the most things that anger me is how many times, whether we're talking about state officials, local officials, or federal, the response to any question has been, sit down, shut up, accept the results. No, if you question it, you're a conspiracy theorist. That is absolutely wrong. That is something that Democrats had railed against for years, whether it was a 2000 election, the 2004 election, or otherwise. And that's something that should never, ever be repeated. But frankly, to go a little bit beyond that, what I really found despicable about yesterday was so much of what the rhetoric was used. President Trump was being accused of inciting violence, which he absolutely did not do, as someone who sat and watched his speech, unfortunately from the comfort of my living room, but I did. And secondly, the idea that the Capitol was quote unquote stormed or otherwise, when we live in a country where the Capitol was actually bombed in 1971 by the Weather Underground, and when Code Pink was happy to disrupt meetings for over 2 decades, and yet there was no problem with those.
Thank you, Phil. Mark, I'm going to go to you because ultimately what both Mike and Phil are pointing out is that Americans need to be able to trust the election and the election process. And it seems that at least for the past 2 decades, since the 2000 elections, they do not. How can the nation survive if order and trust isn't restored to the national electorate?
Well, I think to be fair, that there was a good, election that was held. Certainly, there has been a lot of litigation, a lot of effort to try and challenge specific states, and at the end of the day, the case that was made was appropriate, in which the process allows to be done. But at the end of the day, that there wasn't really enough evidence to suggest that the election was anything but fair. And I think the real breaking point took place when, in effect, you're saying, well, all of that aside, you know, the certifications, we're going to ignore that. We're just going to essentially adopt a completely unconstitutional process to try and reverse that. And I think that, in the eyes of many people, was really a breaking point.
Mike, I'm going to go back to you in a second, but I want to ask a follow-up to Mark. Mark, after the 2000 election, there was certainly a congressional panel that examined what went wrong in the 2000 election. Certainly, there have been enough allegations about voting irregularities, but also about how states addressed the election this year and changed their laws with respect to how voting was conducted. Shouldn't there be a national commission founded to study this, to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Well, I certainly welcome that. I mean, there is regular and ongoing evaluation of it and the various techniques and the various approaches. And you put your finger on a key issue, which was that this year, because we didn't have as many votes cast in person, we were allowed to have more mail-in ballots and more participated that way, which does create a whole new process. But I really got to say that the evidence that there was kind of wholesale fraud is just not there. I mean, every opportunity was provided to be able to come forward, again, appropriately so. You know, you got to abide by the results at the end.
Now, Mark, I have to disagree with you. There have been plenty of reasonable allegations that were never looked into. A couple of days ago, Project Veritas, for example, came out with some video that showed how thousands of people were registered to vote at one homeless shelter in Atlanta. Now, is using an address like that illegal or inappropriate? No. But should we know who is registered, why, if they're legitimately citizens? The idea that applications for absentee ballots in Georgia, for example, were mailed out to everybody on the voter rolls. It is perfectly reasonable for someone who no longer lives in Georgia, but is still registered to vote in that state, to receive that application and say, hey, you know what? If the state thinks I should be able to vote, maybe I'll go ahead and vote. And looking to all of the other states that were discussed, the fact that we have something close to 7 where there are these questions, that should astound us.
Well, I think that reemphasizes the need for a national commission to examine this. But I want to go back to Mike, because I know, Mike, you disagree with what Phil said about President Trump's speech. And I'll preface this by saying that President Trump has a unique speaking style, and trying to parse through his words, oftentimes people hear different things, but I'll let you.
Well, they may, but I unfortunately had the opportunity to sit and watch his hour-long tirade as well, and I was astounded to have a sitting president to go on making the accusations that he did as fallaciously as he did, and then basically tell everybody, we're going to go march on Capitol Hill. In fact, I'm going to lead you there. Not that anybody actually, well, apparently some of the people who were walking thought he was actually walking with them. I don't think any rational person thought that was happening. And then, you know, then they thought that it was okay to go do this. And Phil, with all due respect, because somebody else bombed the facility in 1971, in no way apologizes or acknowledges that what happened yesterday was right, okay, in any way a rational thing that could have occurred. I mean, just because a bad thing previously occurred does not justify what occurred yesterday at all.
I'm sorry, Mike, but how many times did we march on the Capitol? Blacks march on the Capitol, women march on the Capitol, you name it. We all march on the Capitol.
Were they throwing things through the windows? I don't recall ever having seen that before.
I'll be interested to see, you know, in the heat of the moment, we look at the video and are incited by what we saw. It was terrible. No one can justify the violence that occurred yesterday. It was a terrible occurrence. But I'd like to understand what motivated some individuals, because it wasn't all, to actually take to the barricades and charge the barricades.